3. Unsealing sense in Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. If we look merely into the book of nature, death appears an inscrutable sick mystery, a strange and unaccountable anomaly among the arrangements of providence, but if we look into the book of God's word, we find a satisfactory explanation of the phenomenon. W. B. Clark, Asleep in Jesus, 1856. 'Twas like a maelstrom, with a notch, that mirror, every day, kept narrowing its boiling wheel. Emily Dickinson, c. 1862. Afforded pride of place in the Lemaire's story, which it would be easy though incorrect to characterize as a grotesquely trivial inquest into the fin de siècle culture of decadence, is a character whose experience recalls similarly transmogrifying events in which bodies, physical and narrative, register in their extremity a catastrophic dissolution of ontological security, a literary event common to and saliently indicative of a late 19th century moment that bore witness to what George Levine describes as epistemology in crisis, wherein knowing is dying and killing, as it surprisingly becomes in much 19th century narrative. One thinks in this context of Ludwig Holly's faithful manservant, Job, whose face one only had to look at it faithfully transcribes the terror of a man utterly broken down beneath the last dire sight of the once resplendent body shot emerging from the pillar of life, a hideous mockery, dreadful relic, and shocking epitome of human beauty and human life. Another unwilling witness of men unveiled, Stevenson's hasty Lanyon knows that his life is forfeit shaken to its roots after, as he says, I saw what I saw, I heard what I heard of Jekyll's transformation, I feel that my days are numbered, and that I must die. His language here darkly reminiscent of God's stark statement to Moses in Exodus 33:20 that there shall no man see me, and live. Point 2. Then there is Wells's Edward Prendick, a man alone who returns from his sojourn on Dr. Moreau's island less definitively though no less essentially dead to the world, or Basil Hallward, Dorian Gray, and Kurtz, the consequences of whose fateful inquiries into the unknown are too well known to require review, or even, several decades later, Robert Blake, in Lovecraft's Haunter of the Dark, 1936, in whom body and memoirs, the blindly scrawled entries and frenzied jottings of a spasmodically contracted right hand converge, each made textuary by the markings of convulsive fright. Point 3. Ancestor to them all is, of course, Poe's nameless author of the manuscript found in a bottle, who has just time enough to record his recognition that his destruction will coincide with the attainment of some exciting knowledge, some never to be imparted secret, to be born of his imminent delivery into the grasp of the whirlpool and his going down into the same depths that Emily Dickinson expected to explore once a plank in reason broke, and, in her imagined post-mortem state, she dropped down, and down / and hit a world. At every plunge, / and finished knowing and . For as tale-tellers faced with the dilemma anticipated by post-plumber of the depths of the maelstrom, who laments that he will never be able to tell his old companions on shore about the mysteries he encounters, and desirous, in addition, of setting forth an ingenious way of disclosing some portion of the finalities that are without exception confined to the grave, so the final dash in Dickinson's final line hints, authors sometimes substitute characters who, like Marlowe, are permitted to draw back their hesitating foot from the edge of experience and who are therefore allowed to escape death although limited thereby to a lesser order of knowledge. Point 5. Before he loses himself a second time, and this time permanently as everybody knows now, he has never returned within the epilogue premonitory of a future black and blank. Wells's time traveler returns from an absence of several 100,000 years duration, gray and with hair disordered. He is seared, that is, with the telltale marker of near knowing born by Coleridge's ancient grey beard loom, or Poe's narrator whose hair, once jetty black, raven black, has grown white in the space of the day it takes him to descend into the maelstrom, or Rider Haggett's Leo Vinci, whose hair, once of the ruddiest gold, turns grey and then snow white in the immediate aftermath of Ali Shah's accelerated deteriorative evolution, or Kipling's P.G. Carnahan, who returns from Kafiristan with a drawn face, surmounted by a shock of grey hair, or Stoker's Jonathan Harker, whose whitening hair frames a face grown ashen in response to the narrative that reveals his wife's defilement. Point 6. Rejecting the old story of the Faustian overreacher as insufficient to explain or justify the persisting story of self-abnegation for the sake of truth that is ubiquitous in the literature of horror and manifests itself too in the oppressive fatality that is so common in Victorian fiction in general, Levine traces the shared metaphor, common to the epistemological and metaphorical traditions at work in scientific discourse and literature, respectively, of death or self-destruction to an ideal of objectivity to which science professed allegiance, an ideal predicated on the paradoxical assertion of death as a condition of knowing. 7. The senses being suspect because unreliable, so the argument went they prevent access to the very knowledge of which, for the Kantian positivists, they were assumed to be the sole source and conductor. Citing Darwin's self-effacing assertion that he had attempted to write his own autobiography as if I were a dead man in another world looking back at my own life as an example of the phenomenon whereby knowledge becomes an odd process of alienation and possession, Levine goes on to suggest that, in the tradition of Western positivism, observation, the first requisite of knowledge, the means by which it registers in experience, entails both the creation of another and possession of it. To observe oneself one must stand outside oneself, divide oneself into. The act of knowing becomes an act of repossession. So to know is both to kill and to possess. If you really want to know, you will have to die, although if you die you can't know, and along the way you will probably have to kill the thing you want to know. That Henry James's notorious 1898 exploration of horror, an excursion into chaos, as he called it, coils itself about the related issues of discovery, discernment, death, and possession is perhaps nowhere more temptingly suggested than in the desperately victorious declaration I have you in which the governess claims as a supreme surrender and tribute to her devotion what is surely the most testatory and least soluble revelation of the meaning of the events she describes in the manuscript that she leaves behind. Peter Quint, you devil. Where? 9. What follows her charge is punctuated cry, part declarative, part imprecatory, part interrogatory, all parts equally irreducible, is a series of inversionary statements in which loss is refigured as recovery. With the stroke of the loss I was so proud of, he uttered the cry of a creature hurled over an abyss, and the grasp with which I recovered him might have been that of catching him in his fall. Dispossession as repossession. I caught him, yes, I held him, it may be imagined with what a passion, but at the end of a minute I began to feel what it truly was that I held, an irresolution as finality. The concluding word of the story stopped providing the governess with the occasion for endpoint, the epitome of a narrative in which she struggles to reclaim what the little heart, once dispossessed, 198, still withholds access, that is, to its closely guarded store of secrets. One suspects that any clear statement that Miles might have discovered at the story's close would have seemed as ludicrously inadequate, and as incapable of bearing the weight of emotion that drives the governess's urgent inquiries, as that which Mrs. Groves, in her simple sharpness, poses as the cause of the boy's dismissal from school he stole. 184. The droll pallor of her hypothesis invites precisely the sort of contempt that James anticipated as his artistic reward had what he owned as my bad things proven insufficiently bad, shrinking instead to the compass of some particular brutality, some particular immorality, some particular infamy portrayed. Preface, 176. Point 10. The governess's starkly unanswered questions. What then did you do? But to whom did you say things? Were they then so many? What were these things? Whom do you mean by he? 195 to 97. Seem in themselves disproportionately scant when measured against the critical mass of narrative that comes to contain them. Yet, the scales of the balance hang with the right evenness. The phrasing is James's, drawn from his juxtaposing of the familiar and the strange. Preface, 164. Once they are weighted with the governess's interpretive energies, as she herself acknowledges, it seems to me indeed, she confesses, in retrospect, that by the time the morrow's sun was high I had restlessly read into the facts before us almost all the meaning they were to receive from subsequent and more cruel occurrences. 116 to 17. However blind she may appear in other things, she betrays in this admission a Jamesian sensibility, inclined as she is to appreciate what James identifies in the preface to the Oxford Papers. It serves the same critical function for the turn of the screw, as the thinness that allows him space enough in which to insinuate his artist's interest, deciding what he shall add to the bare facts of intimation and how he shall turn them. Preface, 170, 163, emphasis mine. Moreover, her qualification in retrospect establishes her position, temporally, in relation to the precipitating events of her narrative as roughly analogous to that which James seeks to occupy spatially in relation to his own literary sources and shadows, that is, in sight of a palpable imaginable visitable past in the nearer distances and the clearer mysteries, the marks, and signs of a world we may reach over to as by making a long arm we grasp an object at the other end of our own table. Preface, 164. One envisions, in retrospective consideration of this aesthetic condition, the table that comes at last to mark the contested ground. Within his conceit, James inverts the space that figures in his preface as the common expanse, firm and continuous, between the governess and her opponent. So we circled about, with terrors and scruples, like fighters not daring to close. 192, who is also the object of her desire, the boy whom, with a moan of joy, she variously enfolded, drew close, held to her breast. 193, and finally, with a veritable leap, 197, across the space that the table interrupts, presses possessively and conclusively against herself. Herself within reach in the tremor of her hands, at arm's length from her heart's desire the human soul. 193, that waits at the other end of the table at which she comes at last to sit, in high state. 187, the governess eventually consigns her story to the guardianship of Douglas, who is in turn so fully within reach of his own narrative subject. She was a most charming person. She was my sister's governess. She was the most agreeable woman I've ever known in her position. I found her at home on my coming down the second summer. I was much there that year and we had, in her off hours, some strolls and talks in the garden, talks in which she struck me as awfully clever and nice. 83, that his subsequent reading of her text seems to capture her with a fine clearness that was like a rendering to the ear of the beauty of his author's hand. 88. So persuasive is his conviction that her story won't tell in any literal, vulgar way. 84, that the unnamed narrator into whose hands the manuscript ultimately falls averse in his turn that without a few words of prologue a proper intelligence. 85, of the governess's narrative is impossible, and behind him all lurks James, still within reach of the homely pretext and the distinguished host that put him in possession of the scantest of fragments, the precious pinch extracted from an old silver snuff box and held between finger and thumb, the germ, gleaming there in the wayside dust of life, deftly to be picked up. Preface, 169 to 70. Still, nothing he can relate concerning Douglas's prefatory warning that the story is beyond everything for sheer terror, for dreadful dreadfulness, and for general uncanny ugliness and horror and pain. 82, adequately prepares the reader for the verbal assault leveled in and through Miles's outraged and outrageous deathbed cry. This is not to say that what James referred to in his notebook as the strangely gruesome effect of the governess's story does not build steadily from the earliest stages of its telling, from her receipt of the letter hinting that Miles's may have been a contaminating presence at his boarding school, to her growing certainty that there are depths. 121, that are penetrated by each succeeding turn of the screw with the steady accretion, that is, of rumored facts possessed, to her, of terrible implications. 11 Quint, for example, did what he wished with them all. 124, with Miss Jessel and the housemaids, and particularly with Miles, whom he had sought to spoil. 115, while Miles was with the man and Flora with the woman, the arrangement suiting them all. 129. In this sense James's story is an ironic exemplar of the romance as Hawthorne defined it, its high truth never any truer, and seldom any more evident, at the last page than at the first, or opposed belief that the desideratum of analytical composition is achieved only when the work proceeds step by step, to its completion with the precision and rigid consequence of a mathematical problem, or yet again, of the architectural conception of work, a condition of literary art, which, as Pater mapped it, foresees the end in the beginning and never loses sight of it, and in every part is conscious of all the rest, till the last sentence does but, with undiminished vigor, unfold and justify the first, or still again, of James's own sense of the romantic, which, as he defined it, typically vigorously, is contingent upon the haunting presences of one's past living on, up to our own day, the romance value conferred by long survival. Preface, 160 to 61. Point 12. The governess's narrative begins at just the moment when Miles's heart, and, by extension, her experience at Bly, is stopped, and, conversely, the depths of her story are just discernible beneath the pellucid surface of its beginning, yet the fact remains that nothing in the preceding pages sufficiently braces the careful reader for the shock of horror that Miles's death delivers. His final cryptic cry may be said to embody what James described in one letter as terror put bien en adver, the dear old sacred terror that the new crop or new type of ghost story, to his mind, failed miserably to convey, so that the story that contains it, in turn, may be thought of as constituting James's lament for a beautiful lost form. Preface, 169. Point 13. True to his manner, however, James subjects to cold artistic calculation. Preface, 172. Not only the literary form, the literature of horrors, as he calls it in his review of Mary Elizabeth Bratton's Aurora Floyd 1865, 14, whose loss he laments, but also the cultural traditions and attitudes that facilitated its emergence. In other words, The Gothic tradition, the Victorian ars moriendi, the publicly ritualized and authorized enactment, one might say, of the twin actions of dying and knowing, and the cult of the child, each a mystery, a mark, a sign of a palpable, imaginable, visitable cultural past of which James's reader remains within reach, are invoked, inverted, and reconstituted in the climactic death scene, the final slight but scantless turn of the screw that succeeds in transforming James's story from a fairy tale pure and simple to an excursion into chaos, a hybridized amused whose charm is reserved for the jaded, the disillusioned, the fastidious, in short, for the distracted modern mind. Preface, 171-72. Douglas fires his audience's imagination by employing several stock performative strategies, exercising a quiet art that lends the utmost price to and assures the triumph of his delivery. He hedges and hunts for words, repeatedly interrupting himself or weighing one word against another, and then rejecting both. It's beyond everything. Nothing at all that I know touches it. For sheer terror. I remember asking. He passed his hand over his eyes, made a little wincing grimace. For dreadful dreadfulness. For general uncanny ugliness and horror and pain. Well then, I said, just sit right down and begin. He turned around to the fire, gave a kick to a log, watched it an instant. Then as he faced us again, I can't begin. I shall have to send to town. There was a unanimous groan at this. 82. He continually defers the satisfaction of his listener's curiosity and indeed heightens it by avoiding the actual telling of the story of which he has afforded only tantalizing glimpses. Who was it she was in love with? The story will tell, I took upon myself to reply. Oh, I can't wait for the story. The story won't tell, said Douglas. Won't you tell, Douglas? Somebody else inquired. He sprang to his feet again. Yes, tomorrow. Now I must go to bed. Good night. And, quickly, catching up a candlestick, he left us slightly bewildered. 84. The bait that attracts his audience, however, is the actual subject of his story, that is, a visitation that had fallen on a child. 81. Douglas makes no secret of the obvious appeal of his subject, openly acknowledging that a little boy, at so tender an age, adds a particular touch. And gives the effect another turn of the screw. 81. And when he asks what effect two children give to a ghost story, his audience is ready to respond. 2 turns. 81. They need little prompting. Versed as they are in Gothic conventions and in the Victorian celebration of childhood, both of which provide an aura or penumbra for his question. The mock Gothic is at work throughout Douglas's story, and, by extension, throughout James's story, which from its outset the story had held us, round the fire, sufficiently breathless. 81. Puts to ironic uses the very Gothic traditions and modes to which James draws mock affectionate attention in his preface in his allusion, that is, to the starting point, itself burrowed within the layered contexts that include the circle, one winter afternoon, round the hall fire of a grave old country house, the talk that turned to apparitions and night fears, and the solicitation for something seasonable by the promoters of a periodical dealing in the time-honored Christmas tide toy. Preface, 169-70. Douglas acts the part of the necromancer and palingenicist as, with immense effect, he commences reading to the hushed little circle on the night. 85. Several days after striking the spark of his audience's imagination with the information that he possesses a manuscript telling a story quite too horrible. 82. Their ready responses, oh, how delicious, cried one of the women. 82. Bespeak their recognition that theirs is the role of recipient listener consumed by rage of curiosity. 85. Hungry to decipher and decode elusive hints and partial revelations, but also confident that the story will impart to them what James calls the sense, all charming of the terrible pleasant. Preface, 169-70. The vaguely erotic but finally non-threatening feeling that James's disciple M.R. James would later describe as pleasantly uncomfortable. 15. At the time when the turn of the screw made its first appearance, both audiences, the fictive and the actual, were equally familiar with the conventions governing the Victorian cult of childhood. Although it accorded with their larger belief in the perfectibility of man, the tendency to sentimentalize and idealize childhood did not, of course, originate with the Victorians, for the influence of the French philosophes and the German romantics had already begun to shape cultural attitudes during the preceding century. Rousseau's insistence in Emile, 1762, that childhood has its own ways of seeing, thinking, and feeling, and that nothing is more foolish than to try and substitute our ways for them, anticipates what would later become a commonplace, that children represented a different, and even a higher, order of being and consciousness. 16. Blake associated childhood with divinity, and Arthur Schopenhauer, some years later, associated it with something equally outre. Every child is, to a certain extent, a genius, he observed, and every genius is, to a certain extent, a child. 17. Thomas Jefferson Hogg reminds us of the afternoon stroll in which Shelley sought to prove definitively that infants must retain visions of another world, memories that fall away from us as we grow older. Having caught hold on Magdalen Bridge of a several weeks old infant, he insisted on asking its mother, "Will your baby tell us anything about pre-existence, madam?" When she demurred, Shelley insisted that the baby could speak if he would, for he is only a few weeks old. He may fancy perhaps that he cannot, but it is only a silly whim. He cannot have forgotten entirely the use of speech in so short a time. The thing is absolutely impossible. The baby failing to relent, the exasperated poet exclaimed, "How provokingly close are those newborn babes." 18. By the mid-19th century, both child and mother had come to be thought of as mediating figures retaining intuitive and imaginative powers as well as a natural vitality and a natural, if untutored, piety. As Ruskin saw it, childhood often holds a truth in its feeble fingers, which the grasp of manhood cannot retain, and which it is the pride of utmost age to recover. 19. Wells's characterization of the Eloi may owe something to the growing conviction that human evolution would reveal itself in neoteny in the progressive juvenilization, that is, manifesting itself as an evolutionary phenomenon within a particular species. 20. Seeking biological evidence for the fact that the child is really the father of the man, for the modern man is becoming more and more of a child. Alexander Francis Chamberlain argued in his turn of the century study of the evolution of man that, within an individual lifetime, and not within that of the species, which was as a whole, he believed, entering a neotenous phase, upward zoological evolution is most pronounced in infancy, whereas, with maturation, humankind forfeits the comparatively ultra-human character of early childhood. The fall, if there be one for the race, is in the descent from the high promise of childhood to the comparative barrenness of senility. 21. To die as a child, then, is to avoid the several falls, biological and spiritual, that lie in wait for humankind, and to enter prematurely into that final sleep is to recover early from what A.S.B's 19th century fictitious poet, Christ Abel Lamott, conceives of as the regressive stumble into the brute sleep of adult truth. 22 Such, at least, is the message contained in the Victorian comfort books that are the subject of a study by Judith Plotz. Since the loveliness of childhood is obliterated by maturation into adulthood, she writes, the child who survives into adulthood has, in a sense, died as a child, whereas the child who dies remains quintessentially childlike indeed. He is the only lasting child. 23 The dead child, then, was thought twice blessed, granted everlasting life in the memories of those left behind. He or she was deemed far more likely than those who reached adulthood to secure eternal bliss. The Victorians would have remembered, in this regard, the words of Matthew. Except ye be converted, and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Matt 18:3. If the living child, then, was understood to be a figure of authority, how much more so the dying child, who, still trailing clouds of glory and imbued with something of the divine afflatus, sinks into the visionary state of grace in which, in the words of one 19th century minister, hovering as it were midway between earth and heaven, he catches a glimpse of the spiritual world before he leaves the material. 24 The ardor with which the Victorians celebrated childhood was to be matched only by the fervor with which they celebrated the hour of death, and the intersection of the two, the cult of childhood and the ars moriendi, provided for some of the most effective deathbed scenes in Victorian literature. As John Cusick reminds us in his analysis of Little Nell's death in Dickens's The Old Curiosity Shop, 1841, the Victorians viewing death as the most important event of an individual lifetime and furthermore throwing themselves into their love of death with a specificity of emotion that signals some greater significance made the etiquette of mourning and burial into an elaborate catechism. 25 Dickens provides us with one version of this ritualized performance in the chapter of Dombey and Son, 1848, in which Paul Dombey learns what the waves were always saying. Lying tranquilly in his bed, Paul studies the sunbeams that dance on the walls of his bedroom like golden water. As he grows weaker, he begins to associate them with the dark river which rolls towards the sea in spite of him. 26 Various visitors drift in and out of his flickering consciousness. Old Mrs. Pipchin becomes Miss Tox, who becomes Louisa Chick. As his death approaches, he makes various requests, asking, for example, to see his banished nurse, Polly Toodles, and pleading that his father should remember Walter, for Paul was fond of Walter. 224, locked in the arms of his beloved sister Florence, he can at last hear what the waves are always saying only as he catches sight of eternity, tell them that the print upon the stairs at school is not divine enough. The light about the head is shining on me as I go. 225, the scene largely adheres to conventional deathbed rituals. Paul is surrounded by mourning relatives, to whom he makes his final farewells as well as his final requests, which are understood to be sacrosanct, and his spoken behests are followed by less intelligible murmurings that suggest that, for him, the pall of mortality that obscures the afterlife is being lifted. Those ways in which the scene fails to conform to deathbed norms, for example, the fact that his relatives mourn individually rather than communally, are equally significant for what they reveal about the distressed state of Mr. Dombey's domestic affairs. It is worth noting as well that Mr. Dombey's implacability is evidenced in his subsequent willful failure to honor his dying son's request. Such theatrical performances were not limited to Victorian fiction. Marguerite Holubetz points out that the ritual celebration of death was the ideal to which people on their deathbeds aspired. 27 excerpts from memoirs, journals, and letters indicate that most people had absorbed and were prepared to enact the rites of death and dying. Thus, the mother of the American child poet Frances Fanny Lavinia Michener records that just as her daughter's sweet disposition manifested itself in the patience with which she bore her sufferings, her purity and state of grace were evident at the hour of her death. 28 Like Paul Dombey, Fanny bids a tender adieu to her relatives and exacts certain promises from them, telling some to take care of mother, and her father to meet her in heaven. She then makes her final statement, duly recorded for the benefit of those who survive her, in which she attests to her love for her mother, best next to Jesus, and to her belief that her sins are all washed away in the blood of the Lamb. Her closing comments are followed by a feverish, and, it is implied, an unpremeditated and unedited, recital of her vision of the hereafter. Presently she said, please turn up the light, for it is growing dark, and a moment later, the light has gone down. On being told it was still burning, she replied, the light is all right, but it is still dark, and I know why, but it is all right. I'm not afraid to die. I'm growing cold. Gazing through the darkness, she said, I can see you all yet, and each name for the last time lingered lovingly on her lips. Mother best of all next to Jesus. Then as if gazing beyond, it is all light now. Goodbye, goodbye. I'm going home, home, home forever and forevermore. Again her lips moved faintly, but the last word was inaudible, and with perhaps the word mother or Jesus she had passed through the darkness beyond the shadow into the light of the blessed. 29. Although obviously romanticized in order to fulfill the expectations of Fanny's mourning readers, the report of her death does not differ dramatically in content, form, and ideology from those recorded in private diaries and personal correspondence that would not have enjoyed the same wide circulation as the memoirs of a famous child poet's mother. In a letter dated August 7, 1784, for example, John Choate of Ipswich, Massachusetts, drew upon what were clearly becoming the several stock accoutrements and attitudes of bereavement as he sought to comfort himself and his brother, in whose care his daughter Hannah had died. I received your letter of June 7 sometime since, giving the very melancholy and heavy news of the death of my dear daughter Hannah. I should have wrote you before, but want of opportunity and the discomposure of mind under so great a trial will I hope plead my excuse. Although we had no rational grounds to expect Hannah would continue any considerable length of time when my wife left her, yet death came unexpected, and my wife and children as well as myself are greatly affected with the loss. And, oh, brother, I doubt not but you and sister were sensibly touched with the loss of one who, perhaps not without good reason, you expected much comfort from, but the agreeable account you gave of the frame and temper of her mind, her calm composedness, her resignation to the divine will, her beautiful expressions to her mourning friends around her, her firm faith in the blessed Jesus, and her happy prospect of the heavenly Canaan at the near approach of death, and while actually passing thr degree the gloomy veil, and in with the king of terror, alph degree very affecting, yet does administer unspeakable comfort to her surviving friends who do not mourn as those who have no hope but have the fullest evidence to conclude that our sweet child is now in yonder glory celebrating redeeming love. I most heartily join you in adoring the riches of God's free grace and the wonderful plan of salvation wrought out by our blessed Jesus, and in particular for his communicating his grace in so wonderful a manner to my dear departed child. May God have all the glory, and may we be enabled from the heart to say God's will be done. He has our lives, our comforts, and are all in his hands. He give and he takes away, and blessed be his name. 30. Aside from the high degree of cultural shaping, as Michael Wheeler calls it, that is evinced in the shared vocabulary and common structure of such descriptions of deathbed scenes, what links them is the implication that the Moment of death is a revelatory one, for both the living and the deceased. 31 The latter struggles, usually with only limited success, to describe some part of his order divinations, or communications of grace, as John Chode referred to them. The former, on the other hand, cherished the dying visionary's final statement as a text laden with intimations of immortality, intimations that may, with time and study, generate new texts and provide the impetus for interpreting the prophetic or homiletic inscriptions contained therein. Chode's letter rehearses, in little, this very movement. An expression of his own grief is followed by a description that signals his reception of the message conveyed to and then transmitted by his brother, who witnessed the various stages of his daughter's physical dissolution. Thus, in the text in which he recapitulates her death and deliverance, Chode can speak with confidence of having divined the riches of God's free grace in the wonderful plan of salvation wrought out by our blessed Jesus. His faith is anchored in a culturally sanctioned conception of death as occurring at the authorizing moment when, as Elizabeth Bretven puts it, an inherent though invisible truth could apathetically be fulfilled, where an otherwise incommunicable secret could be made visible. 32 Knowing that the eyes glaze once and that is death / impossible to feign, and trusting moreover that it is impossible to sham or simulate the convulsions and throes accompanying death to perform self-consciously, that is, for an admiring audience the coveted acquisition of sublime and eternal truths, and the bodily narration thereof. Emily Dickinson confessed to liking a look of agony, / because I know it's true. In focusing more specifically upon the experience of the dying child, the deathbed scenes featured in Chode's letter or A.E.M.'s memoir recast the child as hero. Debarred because of their youth or frailty from other forms of social or public achievement, such child heroes achieve, as plot suggests, a kind of grandeur in their death. 33 Children are memorable figures in death not only, or even primarily, because they show pietistic fortitude in extremis, however, but also because they have not yet fallen into the adulterating world of sophisticated modes and manners, and so retain visions of pre-existence, however ineffable, residual, and inarticulable, that only enhance those of eternity that are revealed, and thus intensified, at the hour of death. In his comfort book for bereaved parents, a Reverend W.B. Clark speculated that, poised at such a transformative moment and suspended, not in a state of unconsciousness, but in a state of vastly increased activity, the believer espies the glories of paradise, which are partially disclosed to his view while the distant tones of its hymns of sweetest melody burst upon his ravished ear. 34 Such beliefs were still widespread in the early 20th century, although they became less overtly Christian. Wells's The Door in the Wall, 1911, for example, describes one such vividly portentous experience. The adult Lionel Wallace, Wells's protagonist, admits to a friend that he is haunted by the memory of a beauty and a happiness that filled his heart with insatiable longings that made all the interests and spectacle of worldly life seem dull and tedious and vain to him. 35 The memory concerns an excursion, undertaken in early childhood, through a green door in a white wall that led to a garden full of the quality and promise of heart's desire. 10. He recalls that going through the door was just like coming home. 9. And though fragmentary in nature, his memory consists of an impression of delightful rightness. 10. That his was an early excursion into another and perhaps an extra worldly domain seems clear by the story's end, when, determined not to forego an opportunity that has several times presented itself to him, but that he has ignored in the course of an ambitious life, he passes through what he takes to be the much-desired door and falls to his death in a deep excavation. His friend speculates that although by our daylight standard he walked out of security into darkness, danger, and death, viewed from Wallace's own childlike perspective, the door seemed to provide a secret and peculiar passage of escape into another and altogether more beautiful world. 24. One of the central tenets of late 19th century horror literature is that our reality is really fantasy, and our visionary, often nightmare, fantasies, true reality. That perception was exploited by Algernon Blackwood, William Hope Hodgson, Oliver Onions, and others who kept alive the fears and desires that belong to a pre-enlightenment, pre-rationalist worldview. The adult world that Wells reconstructs in The Door in the Wall seems grey and dull and common, whereas Wallace's premonitory vision reveals a realm infused with an indescribable quality of translucent unreality. 13 A reality starkly at odds with that hinted at in the desperate cry to which I alluded earlier, Peter Quint you devil. Where Miles's dying pronouncement proves horrific at least in part because it conveys a truth if it can be said, that is, to convey anything definitive that seems grossly antithetical to those expressed by the dying. Innocence so ubiquitous in Victorian literature. In an essay on vulgarity in literature in which he employs the sticky overflowings of Little Nell's death scene as an exemplar, Aldous Huxley claimed that the suffering and death of children raise the problem of evil in its most unanswerable form. 36 His suggestion is that such a circumstance calls into question the beneficence of the divinity who could sap the vitality of such precious beings and simultaneously beggar those whose best hopes for the future resided in them, forcing a confrontation with what Cusick calls the abyss of negativity, over the edge of which Pater appears to have peered when, happening upon a dark space on the brilliant grass the black mold lying heaped up round it an open child's grave, he divined it. Physical horror of death, with its wholly selfish recoil from the association of lower forms of life, and the suffocating weight above. 37 The form that Miles's unexpected death takes complicates Cusick's contextualization of such a statement as Huxley's. What happens when, demonically inspired, the child becomes the medium through whom we confront not merely the abyss of negativity, contact with which was perceived as facilitating what Cusick terms an initiation into a kind of transcendental genuineness, but rather the abime itself, the child in such a context functioning not as an innocent victim but as an active participant in the transmission of evil. 38 What happens, in other words, when the dying child espies not grace and sanctification, the message of the visions figured in the glow of the little match seller's matches, but damnation and demon madness, what the child of Gerda's Erlkenike C 1782 encounters in the course of his fatal midnight ride, what the young servant in Braddon's The Shadow in the Corner 1879 sees in her room night after night, leading her, in the end, to take her own life. What, in the last analysis, had I to give a sense of, is the question James puts to his reader in the preface to his Amused, the question to which he, without delay, answers that the utmost conceivability. Preface, 176, the inordinate, the incalculable, the tragic, yet exquisite, mystification, preface, 172-73, of his sinister romance, preface, 170, depends less on their being a haunting pair, capable, as the phrase is, of everything than on the more carefully turned contingency of their exertions expressing themselves in respect to the children, the very worst action small victims so conditioned might be conceived as subject to. Preface, 176. Douglas's concession that the piquancy, particular touch is his phrase, of the tale he has to relate derives from the appearance of an apparition to a child at so tender an age is prompted by an allusion to a case in which a visitation had fallen on a child, the turn of the screw 81. The visitation that falls upon Miles and Flora, its very busy tent is the term invoked by the governess to describe Peter Quint and Miss Jessel, is not of the sort that Job experienced, preserving his spirit and delivering life and favor. Job 10:12. It is closer in nature to those other biblical visitations that have their genesis in abominations. J12. That deliver desolation and days of recompense. Pose 9:7. And that reveal the prophet as a fool and the spiritual man's madness. Pose 9:7. Miles's cry proves destabilizing in other ways as well. Just as nothing in Douglas's opening comments would have prepared James's late Victorian audience for the shock, so nothing in Victorian deathbed fiction would have prepared them to interpret it. Although hieroglyphic in the sense that the language in which it is expressed reflects the transcendence of the moment, the conventional deathbed utterance was understood to contain the truth that, if carefully scrutinized, could be comprehended, thus serving as a signpost on the path to righteousness for those left behind. The fact that God's wonderful plan of salvation, bastardized in other contexts by the imperfect and partial terms in which it is lived, comes closest under these circumstances to being phrased in God's own words may help to explain why texts, books, and handwriting are the tropes most commonly applied to the deathbed utterance. Holubet reminds us that Margaret Oliphant availed herself of a practice common among devout evangelicals who recorded the words of a departing saint, who was expected to utter words of wisdom or prophecies at the moment when the veil of the flesh was thought to become transparent in her novel The Minister's Wife, 1869, in which the prophet is allies. Death. Bed ejaculations became the property of the parish, and were repeated far and wide, and finally made into a book. 39. Furthermore, the life that draws to a close assumes most strikingly in its concluding hours the quality and texture of a narrative, invested with the significations that a narrative might be expected to convey. In his near-death experience, for example, Wells's Lionel Wallace meets a somber dark woman, with a grave, pale face and dreamy eyes, who carried a book in the living pages of which he sees himself, as well as the harsh reality of his life. It was a story about myself, and in it were all the things that had happened to me since ever I was born. 11 to 12.40 At such a supercharged moment, and under such extreme circumstances, the dying speaker is, as Brent suggests, imbued with authority, and it is this authority, arising from the aporia of speaking or writing in the shadow of death and against it, that lies at the origin of all narratives. Death is the sanction for all that a storyteller might relate. She or he borrows authority from death. 41 Not merely sanctioning what the storyteller has to tell, death may be said to mimic the narrative that contains it, as Garrett Stewart sees it. Death and fiction are two controlling frameworks within which story and mortality interrogate and exchange with each other. 42. Miles's final statement, however, constitutes a text from which we cannot extract precise meaning. Because it is so constructed actively to resist interpretation, nothing in our training and experience has taught us how to read it. The ultimate solipsistic text, scrutable, perhaps, only to the one whose authority is sanctioned by his imminent death, it creates not meaning but its absence, a vacuum, pulling into itself a series of unanswerable questions. Why does Miles call out Peter Quint? Is he admitting to an unwelcome and unholy association? Does he seek Quint's help in his extremity? Has he suspected that the dead man has become the governess's idée fixe, and does he hurl his name at her as a final condemnatory gesture? Who is the you referred to in You Devil? Quint, whose friendship has damned Miles. The governess, whose ministrations have damned him. Like so much in the story whose abrupt ending it enforces, the statement is cryptic and unreadable. We are left only with questions whose answers are locked deep in the heart of the narrative and of the reader touched by the horrors thus unveiled. James's readers have been no more successful at reading Miles's final statement than in reading Miles himself. Precursor death scenes had taught the Victorians that the victim's body, inscribed with what George Eliot termed a terrible handwriting of human destiny and death, could serve as a signifier of inward as well as past and future states. 43 Thus, as George's Van den Abiel suggests, the charred corpse of Marquis de Sodus Justine aptly killed when a lightning bolt enters her mouth and exits her vagina bears witness to the male, inscriptional violence, the brandings, flagellations, incisions of which it has been the object throughout his Squire to Juliet, 1797.44 One recalls, as well, the mountain of foundering, suppurating flesh, the once relentlessly resplendent blonde Venus now unveiled and revealed as a charnel house of horrors with which Zola loads the deathbed scene that closes his Nana, 1880. Alternatively, in the deathbed scene that dampens spirits and handkerchiefs in both England and America, Little Nell's marmoreal body is encased in a beauty that belies imminent corporeal dissolution and that furthermore testifies to her incorruptibility in life and her sanctity in death. Peace and perfect happiness were imaged in her tranquil beauty and profound repose. 45 Her face is set in the same mild lovely look by which we shall know the angels in their majesty, after death, 654. In reading Little Nell's body, we discover that in its death throes it suffered the seal of salvation and that, consequently, it bears the word. In other words, Dickens establishes a strict correlation between the physical and the metaphysical, for at her grave all outward things and inward thoughts teem with assurances of immortality, 659. In The Turn of the Screw, however, childhood beauty is at best misleading and perhaps a signifier of damnation rather than a state of grace it would seem to embody. Miles and Flora are repeatedly described, by the governess, as being nothing short of seraphic in their beauty. The governess suffers no uneasiness in a connection with anything so beatific as the radiant image of her little girl, who is possessed of an angelic beauty, 90, and the deep, sweet serenity of one of Raphael's holy infants, 91. In Miles, as well, the governess espies on the instant, without and within, a correspondence between outward signs and inward states, that great glow of freshness equally discernible from the first moment in his sister, whose same positive fragrance of purity preludes his own, incredibly beautiful. Miles radiates something divine that she has never found to the same degree in any child, his indescribable little air of knowing nothing in the world but love, 98. Because it would have been impossible to carry a bad name with a greater sweetness of innocence, 98, the governess knows that to so attach such a name to such innocence and to pronounce the loveliness pooled in the depths of blue of the child's eyes a trick of premature cunning would be merely to confess a guilty cynicism, 126, symptomatic of her own innate fallibility or the acquired bad faith of the fallen adult. The children's beauty, however, so far from merely carrying a bad name, comes to name the very opposite of beatific innocence, and to occasion it, for what else when he's so clever and beautiful and perfect could Miles be indicted, she eventually demands to know, but precisely for wickedness, 162. Because she sees in the children nothing but their beauty and amiability as readily as she would have assumed the opposite of those qualities had they been at all visibly blighted or battered, Mrs. Groves rises up before the governess as a magnificent monument to the blessing of a want of imagination, 140, preferring the correlative, associative hermeneutics that the governess herself has formerly entertained. For her own part, the governess comes at last to list ugly feeding as the only crime for which Miles might not have been driven from his school. Whatever else he may be, in table manners he is irreproachable. 188. Although she has from the start shown both a predilection for inversionary approaches to interpretation and a tendency to judge things according to what they are not, as when she earlier constructed the horror of Quint's character out of a cluster of negatives and similes. He isn't a gentleman. He's like nobody. He's like an actor, as, never having seen one, she supposes an actor to be. He's God help me if I know what he is. 11,011. She finds herself forced to finesse her interpretive procedure, fully everything it in order to accommodate her growing recognition that they're more than earthly beauty, their absolutely unnatural goodness are in fact a game, a policy and a fraud. 145. Herein, then, lies one source of horror for James's late Victorian audience, the possibility that the hypocrisy so familiar to Victorian adulthood might already have infiltrated the carefully guarded nursery and infected those preternaturally precocious children. The beauty and apparently innocent intuition so captivating to the governess seem, in the end, to signal contrivance and to carry with them not the fragrance of purity but an odor of death and corruption powerful enough to penetrate the surrounding environs. So that the term shrouded in the passage, the white curtain draping the head of Flora's little bed, shrouded the perfection of childish rest. 133, is a hint that the innocence that had once lain there is, to the governess's engaged imagination, transforming itself into something more ominous. The shock with which James's late Victorian audience would have witnessed the unceremonious destruction of cherished conventions and stereotypes would have matched the shock it must have sustained in its encounter with Dracula. The striking topical and thematic similarities existing between these two fin de siècle Gothics. Stoker's novel had been released the year before James's story made its 1898 appearance in Collier's, suggesting that they are intimately related. 46. Where the prologue of the one story locates the manuscript in a locked drawer, for example, the epilogic note of the other traces the papers recounting the engagement with and defeat of Dracula back to a safe, the subjects of both texts being sufficiently contaminated to require sequestration and containment. 48. In both stories a patrician master conceives of and transmits evil. Like the Count, Quint, the surrogate master at Bly, expresses a vampiric hunger for those whom he would victimize, as well as a similarly imperialistic desire to colonize the occupants, women, and children in particular, of Bly, disclosed in his having been too free with everyone. The term free, as the governess notes, extending not only to the children but also to the half-dozen maids and men who were still of our small colony. Turn of the screw. 115. Both exert an infectious influence, the quality of their monstrosity and their powers of contagion being sufficiently salient to affect real bodies. Whereas the Count imbues his female victims with an evil of a lesser order, he feeds on the women, they feed on the children. Quint would spoil Miles, approaching him with an infernal message. 151, while Miss Jessel, pale and ravenous demon as she was, 175, would get hold of Flora. Just as Van Helsing is the first to discover the source of as well as the threat posed by the impending evil, so the governess alone perceives that damnation is in store for those who are drawn into an intercourse with the undead souls of Quint and Miss Jessel. Assuming the role that Mina adopts when, with the devotion of a martyr, she announces herself prepared to die with the first discernible sign in herself of harm to any that she loves. Stoker 373-74, the governess decides to offer herself as an expiatory victim and, by accepting, by inviting, by surmounting it all, to keep at bay the evil that threatens the tranquility of her companions, the children. I should thus fence about and absolutely save, she declares. Turn of the screw. 114. Discrete comparatives exist between the works. Just as the Count's powers peak nocturnally, so Bly's human bats tend to show themselves at dusk or in the grey dawn hours, and we might recall here that James characterized his two ghosts as not ghosts at all, as we now know the ghost, but goblins, elves, imps, demons who woo their victims forth to see them dance under the moon. Preface. 175. As the Count enters Lucy's room through a window, so Quint is seen most often peering through windows. And as the Count becomes a hunted predator, his pursuers closing round him in wolf-haunted Transylvania, so Quint, his white face of damnation. 193 visible beyond the window through which he peers, describes a slow will rather like the prowl of a baffled beast. 194, as the governess attempts to recover lost territory. References to the dead restored. 144, the return of the dead. 148, and a perception that sometimes brushed the governess's brow like the wing of a bat. 127, further impel one to suspect that James's story sustains an informed dialogue with its predecessor. In the broadest sense, however, both texts draw for their fund of horror from the overturning of stereotypes and the exploding of certain set expectations, among them the high Victorian conviction that, as Brentford puts it, the good death is that of a virtuous and preferably innocent person, of children or virgins. 48. As the turn of the screw offers an equation in which juvenile beauty may exist in direct proportion to the evil it embodies, so Dracula, as many critics have noted, equates the beauty of women, formerly the visible sign of their salvific powers, with predatory allure and mobile sexual desire. 49. The children whom Lucy infects, for example, the very children whose welfare she would otherwise be charged with preserving in her culturally prescribed capacity as one of those good women, whose lives and whose truths may make a good lesson for the children that are to be. Stoker 239, are drawn to her specifically because of her beauty, to their innocent sealed eyes, she is the bluffer lady. 229.50 Even as a corpse, Lucy Westenra is very beautiful. 211, more radiantly beautiful after death, her lips redder, on the cheeks a delicate bloom. 257-58, than she had been living, so that John Seward, her disappointed suitor, marvels to find that instead of leaving traces of decay's effacing fingers, death had but restored the beauty of life. 213. Over time, however, Seward abandons the discredited rhetoric of the mortal lover. He is no Romeo, discovering beauty's ensign in crimsoned lips and cheeks and finding therein the message that Juliet has not been conquered in death. The very fact of her being so beautiful and calm, so fair to look upon like a creature fresh from the hand of God, and waiting for the breath of life, Dickens, Old Curiosity Shop, 652, indicates that Dickens's little Nell has gone to dwell in glory, but Lucy's apparent immunity from corporeal corruption is a sign of her spiritual degradation. Her eyes alone, Lucy's eyes in form and color, but unclean and full of hellfire and ablaze with unholy light. Stoker 271, betray her. Under the tutelage of Van Helsing, a seasoned physiognomist and metaphysician, that is, Dr. Seward learns to be suspicious of the bloom of feminine beauty in general and to understand that postmortem pulchritudine in particular means evil. If ever a face meant death, Dr. Seward announces, "If looks could kill, we saw it at that moment." 272. Just as full-blown feminine beauty comes to be valued as so clear a determinant of uncleanness that Van Helsing rejoices to find the infected Mina Harker looking thin and pale and weak. 477. So the governess despairs when she considers that little Flora, though rosily resplendent in all her pink and golden charm, is every inch of her, quite old. 179. While her extraordinary childish grace, 130, and child sincerity, 179, are explicable only if read as the dissembling typical of an old woman. 172. Versed in the ways of a sophisticated world from which, at Bly, the little girl should have been isolated. Although initially proud of her own capacity for deceit and contrivance, she speaks of the gentlest arts, 92, by which she wins Flora's trust. The governess increasingly portrays herself as a latter-day Merlin practiced upon by scheming children no less poised for beguilement, 131, than Namu herself, so that Miles, for example, with a charming exhibition of tact, of magnanimity, exercises an influence that leaves her with a strange sense of having literally slept at my post, and yet I hadn't really, in the least, slept. I had only done something much worse. I had forgotten. 168. What surpassed everything, she marvels, was that there was a little boy in the world who could have for the inferior age, sex, and intelligence so fine a consideration. 132. This consideration she later identifies as the coefficient of his small strange genius. 190. Although what she comprehends by this culturally weighted term is starkly at odds with the conditions that occasion its use. Miles's genius betrays itself in the sort of precocity that, according to Lombroso, is morbid and atavistic. Common to genius and to insanity, and observable among all savages. 51. However, paradoxically, such precocity was in fact considered to be symptomatic of the arrested stage of human development that, according to Sir James Frazer, was most readily evident in the child who, as Sandra Siegel points out, bore for the Victorian social scientist the same relation to the savage as the adult does to civilization. 52. Thus, the governess likes the success that Quint and Miss Jessel would seem to have enjoyed in making the children still cleverer even than nature did, their achievement being diminished, to her mind, by their having had, in the first place, wondrous material to play on. 180. Miles's cleverness, his delicacy, his discrimination, 190, are all attributable, the governess informs us, to the outbreak in him of the little natural man. 130. Natural having its old Calvinist meaning here rather than the romantic one, just as Dracula's cunning is, for all that it seems nearly insuperable, recognizable to Van Helsing as the fledgling expression of that so great child brain of his. 390, which, being predestinate to crime also, renders him in turn a criminal and of criminal type. Norda and Lombroso would so classify him, and qua criminal he is of imperfectly formed mind. 439. One of Van Helsing's greatest challenges is to convince his associates that there are things old and new which must not be contemplated by men's eyes, because they know or think they know some things which other men have told them. 246. The brutal discrediting of those false truths which other men have told, the assumptions about the sanctity of childish innocence, for example, and the faith and redeeming quality of the truths that spill out of the mouths of dying innocents, complicates a text that would have been sufficiently unnerving even had James not produced one last excruciating turn of the screw precisely at the moment of Miles's death. James's treatment of childhood innocence and in particular of childish insight at the epiphanic moment of death being less reductive than Stoker's treatment of feminine beauty, we confront in the turn of the screw something more complex than the mere inversion of the equation plotted by Wilde's Miss Prism, the good end happily, and the bad unhappily. That is what fiction means, or the aesthetic law, mandating that like be happily married to like, that had been written, so Ruskin argued, into the book of nature, so that what was normal and healthy and good would of necessity assume a bright color and a pleasing shape, whereas what was ill-formed a venomous wood fungus, rotting into black dissolution of dripped slime at its edges would announce a nature blighted and corrupt, and all this appearing, one might add, in the context of a discussion of the odious Darwin's ignorance of good art and the consequent acutely illogical simplicity of his explanation in the descent of man of the widely founded laws governing nature's selection and use of color. Point 53. James's sensibility here is more like what we find, for example, in Flaubert's admission that he cannot look on a cradle without thinking of a tomb, nor contemplate a woman without thinking of her skeleton. 54. We cannot, after all, say definitively that Miles has not in fact been as thoroughly stainless spiritually as he is physically. Moments before she witnesses his death, the governess acknowledges that qualifying her very pity is the appalling alarm of Miles's being perhaps innocent. 196. Discernment, vision, obscurity, what cannot or must not be contemplated by men's eyes, which, according to Van Helsing's calculus, becomes the side of sentience. These concerns at least as pressing in the turn of the screw as, and in the end conterminous with, the question as to whether or not youthful beauty does indeed figure as an accurate indicator of innocence are inextricably bound together in a text that might plausibly be thought of as exploring its own hermeneutics. Look at him. 98, is the governess's antiphonal response to Mrs. Grose's look at her. 95, each pledging a coded allegiance to the high Victorian belief that truth and beauty are interchangeable, cleanly intersecting within a common ground of established equivalencies, and one might recall, in this context, that common past mapped out in James's preface and constituted by a cluster of recognizable cultural markers and signs and artifacts. Both women traffic, as a result, in ocular exchanges. Prodigious and gratified looks. 91. Pass between them, and they meet in long looks. 111. Mrs. Grose gives a look that her confederate remarked at the moment. 94, and the governess reciprocates, annotating her speech by looking prodigious things. 121. Her looks go everywhere, and they are returned in kind, so that when asked to provide proof of her assertion that Miss Jessel is a horror of horrors, the governess promptly retorts that she is certain by the way she looked. 122. Her answer, to her mind, amply definitive and admitting of no ambiguity. The governess represents specular encounters both as a means of communicating the otherwise incommunicable, obscure and roundabout allusions. 91 are contained in those prodigious looks that she settles upon Mrs. Grose, and as a more efficacious way of biting into and finally possessing what might otherwise be elusive and, from the perspective of Bly's ghosts, lost thereby. As the unvarying terminology characterizing her several encounters with him indicates, Quint's appearance fascinates her, as in olden times witches and serpents were said to fascinate their victims. His ability markedly to fix her even as he turned away merely adds to the spectacle. 103, of his first visitation, she notes her own inability in a subsequent encounter to quit his face, although his stare, deep and hard, quits hers and proceeds instead to fix successively several other things. 107. The governess is similarly transfixed by the subsequent sight of Miss Jessel's fierce scrutiny of Flora. She gave me never a glance. She only fixed the child. Mrs. Grose tried to see it. Fixed her. Ah, with such awful eyes. With a determination indescribable. with a kind of fury of intention. I made her turn pale. Intention. To get hold of her. 122. Her predecessor's attention, in this regard, is monstrous, in the Jamesian sense, because it places her in the culturally predetermined space in Victorian literature that locates the power to petrify within the typically masculine sphere of active speculation and identifies the consequent condition of petrifaction as an explicitly feminine state of pure being, the same space that T.S. Eliot redefines when he has his lovesick J. Alfred Prithrock imagine himself as being effeminized, formulated. Sprawling on a pin immobilized, pinned end. Rippling on the wall, by the eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase, 0.55 Quint's capacity, shared by his ghostly companion, to hold her attention to fix me, as she says, from his position, with just the question, just the scrutiny through the fading light, that his own presence provoked, 102, commands the respect of the nominally governing governess. In spite of what she represents as the consanguinity of their positions, however evident, she contends, in their shared, spatial, perspectives and similarly intuited understandings Quint commands wordlessly, effortlessly, whereas she invariably resorts to brute force as a means of compelling her own attendant's compliance in her fixed meanings, in her determined measures. The dashes that suture her insights to those of Mrs. Groves, 44 such stitches cross-hatch their various conversations, give the impression of seamless effort, the two women thinking with one mind, speaking, though antiphonally, ad una voce and arriving, in the process, mutually within sight of a unified field of vision. You do know, you dear thing, the governess insists in one such exchange. Only you haven't my dreadful boldness of mind, and you keep back, out of timidity and modesty and delicacy, even the impression that, in the past, when you had, without my aid, to flounder about in silence, most of all made you miserable. But I shall get it out of you yet. There was something in the boy that suggested to you that he covered and concealed their relation. Oh, he couldn't prevent. You're learning the truth. I dare say. But, heavens, what it shows that they must, to that extent, have succeeded in making of him. If Quint on your remonstrance at the time you speak of was a base menial, one of the things Miles said to you, I find myself guessing, was that you were another. Again her admission was so adequate that I continued, and you forgave him that. Wouldn't you? Oh yes. And we exchanged there, in the stillness, a sound of the oddest amusement. Then I went on, at all events, while he was with the man. Miss Flora was with the woman. It suited them all. It suited me too, I felt, only too well, by which I mean that it suited exactly the particular deadly view I was in the very act of forbidding myself to entertain. 128 to 29. Although suggesting a discursive cooperation, correspondence, and consonance indicative of deeper mutual soundings, 184, the dashes that litter these communications are reminiscent of those that creep into the text of Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, 1892, whose narrator can hardly write a sentence without resorting to dashes and parentheses as a desperate means of indicating the ways in which her own attempted statements are imposed upon and hijacked by the instructions from her husband. John Hall regarding the nature of her problem and state of mind. In the context of the governess's various conversations with Mrs. Groves, the dash-driven statements finally disclose semiotically what the governess indirectly betrays in her tendency in these interviews literally to clutch at her subjects, that is, her fear that her ability to cross over, command, and unconditionally occupy the other side of experience and signification may be limited to her mere physical capacity to do so, as when, following her second encounter with Quint, she places herself where he had stood, and applying her face to the pane looked, as he had looked, into the room, 108. Her appearance to Mrs. Groves so apparently doubling is that the housekeeper retreats, as the governess notes, on just my lines generates not the shock of a certitude and flash of knowledge in the midst of dread, 107, that his presence had delivered, but instead a mere shy heave of surprise, leaving the governess, who is skeptical in any event, because she wonders whether Mrs. Groves's bloom of innocence may not be feigned, prosaically to put out a hand to her and hold her heart a little, liking to feel her close, 109. Fearful that the meanings, that she, like a detective, so wishes to apprehend, may elude her in the end, lost within the very gaps and apertures upon which, paradoxically, her own Jamesian ability to turn the bare facts of intimation to her purpose depends, and doubtful, moreover, whether she can fulfill the expectations of the audience against whose trust her own faith in her powers of discernment is counterpoised, she takes forcible hold of her subjects. Thus she detains Mrs. Groves, holding her there with a hand on her arm, 95, then holding her tighter, 96, dragging her at her heels by the chain of her logic ever too much for her, until, pausing, she sustains her with a grateful arm, 172 to 73. She compels her beleaguered companion to comprehend her, if only in an embrace, as she would contain her verbally, making her a receptacle of lurid things, 141. She held me there a moment, then whisked up her apron again with her detached hand. Would you mind, miss, if I used the freedom to kiss me? No. I took the good creature in my arms and, after we had embraced like sisters, felt still more fortified and indignant. 99. The provisional nature of the governess's linguistic reconstructions, it is she who most often cauterizes the gaping wounds of sentences rent by the typographical gash that punctures speech, becomes more apparent when what substitutes for the momentary silence forced by the dash is the silence that announces the less easily governed spectral exchanges, the intense hush in which, for example, moments before her first encounter with Quint, the sounds of evening dropped, 102, or her sense. Later, that all sounds from Flora had previously dropped, 120, in anticipation of Miss Jessel's appearance by the sea of Azov. She notes that the stranger sharpness of Quint's meanings and intentions, like Miss Jessel's, is not in the least diluted or diminished or deflected, and that both the meanings and the impression that they impart are as definite as a picture in a frame, 102, for all that they are subject to his speechless perspective, which is invariably mediated, seen always only across, as it were, and beyond in strange places and on high places, the top of towers, the roof of houses, the outside of windows, the further edge of pools, but there's a deep design, on either side, to shorten the distance and overcome the obstacle, and the success of the tempters is only a question of time, 146. In spite of such spatial exigencies, that is, the haunting peer pull her deeper along the spiraling and tightening vertical axis of fearful intimation, their success in impressing upon her their deep design of function not, as she sees it, of distance but of duration only. In a statement equally applicable to her own experience and to the reader's encounter with her text, the governess concedes, the more I go over it, the more I see in it, and the more I see in it the more I fear, measuring the passage of time over the space of which, as she plumbed depths, the Jamesian figure in the carpet progressively surfaced, acquiring such clarity and definition that she comes not to know, in her words, what I don't see what I don't fear. 121-22. Although it is more evident to her by her story's close that Gwyn's white face of damnation has been the hideous author of our woe, 197, the governess arrives, at the end of her speculations, merely at the very point of her embarkation, that being the awful conception borne in upon her with a portentous clearness of Quint's wanting to appear to them, 114. Having proven no truer by the last page of the story that she scripts than in the earliest, this deep design her ghost's intention, the site, and source of her awful conception may be said to conform in its essentials to the paid Ryan condition of literary architecture that, foreseeing the end in the beginning, never loses sight of it. The final purpose, the distinctive sign and design of her experience having nearly been fully exposed in the fullness of time, what has changed by her story's close is her relationship to the appalling teleology, her awful conception of confronting a horror of horrors giving way to a despair lest her not seeing Miss Jessel will leave her stranded fatally beyond the reach of her ghost's intentions. Beyond this, she revises an earlier sense that one need only look, dearest woman, look in order to see what appears as big as a blazing fire, namely, the deep design fleshed out in a ghostly presence. You don't see her exactly as we see, you mean to say you don't now. 176, cries the governess, disabused. The governess had begun by equating mere looking with clear seeing, and clear seeing with absolute knowing, the integrity of her reckoning inscribed in the forward continuity of those statements in which looking and seeing and knowing are recapitulated. See him, miss, first. Then believe it. Look at her. 95, or yet again, know that Miss Jessel is a horror of horrors. By seeing her. By the way she looked 122. She learns that looking and seeing name two essentially different procedures, as well as two distinct states of awareness, and that one is alerted to the existence of the depths of the sinister. The phrase is James's, invoked to rename the portentous evil, preface 175, with which he would mantle his predatory creatures, and capable, by extension, of descrying the deepest depths of design depending on whether one's eyes are sealed to evil, a term that she fixes upon in the latter portion of her narrative as she comes more aggressively to differentiate between the visionary acuities of her companion and her charges and their allied capacity to distill essence from appearance. She fears, for example, that her own eyes might be sealed just while those of her charges were most opened, a consummation for which it seemed blasphemous not to thank God. 149-50. Although she rues Mrs. Grose's blindness, that good woman's deep groan of negation, repulsion, compassion establishing her exemption from the sight of Miss Jessel, which in turn stands as proof that her eyes were hopelessly sealed. 176. Yet she considers it prodigious that, through her efforts, Miles's sense was sealed. 194. To the visitant with whom he would communicate. Even at the last, the boy can catch with his sealed eyes the direction of her words only, his confusion recorded in the pocked and punctuated cry that follows his glaring vainly over the place and missing wholly the wide, overwhelming presence of Quint. 197. In employing the term as she does, the governess locates the side of insufficiency and incapacity in those baffled recipients of visions and visitations and transforms, by extension, her dreadful liability to impressions of the order so vividly exemplified, 113, into the authority that sanctions and seals her own readings of the texts available to her, Quint's appearance, and the design it embodies, Miss Jessel's appearance, and the intention it embodies, Miles's appearance, or look, and the premature cunning it covers and conceals. James's own invocation of the term suggests a slightly variant designation that highlights its capacity, grammatically and semantically, to occupy several oppositional, and often contradictory, realms of signification and possibility. In his preface, for example, James uses the term to refer to the condition of certain texts. His examples are varied, ranging from literary texts to their starting point, their source and the occasion for their transmission, which, in their preeminent self-containment, are absolutely sealed and beyond test or proof. Preface 162. His sense of the word echoes, although it does not duplicate, that conveyed in a passage from Isaiah, for the Lord hath closed your eyes, the prophets and your rulers, the seers hath he covered. And the vision of all is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, read this, I pray thee, and he saith, I cannot, for it is sealed. Isa 29:10-11. Hence the Oxford English Dictionary definition of a sealed book as a term used predicatively of something involved in obscurity, or beyond a person's capacity to understand. Because their meanings are so entirely predetermined and discrete, yet simultaneously and paradoxically outlived and lost and gone. Preface 164, sealed in the silent authority of the past and all its varied sources, such texts grant no license to fantasticate. Preface 165, as James has it, although one might argue that is alluding at all to the temptation to take such license serves as evidence that, true to form, he is invoking the very definition of the term that the governess draws upon, that which comprehends the capacity to divine occult possibilities, that in turn allows one either to decipher or to create works such as the turn of the screw itself, works that bask in an unattackable ease, will not be baited by earnest criticism. Preface 169, resist surrendering their meanings, and refuse, like the German book of which Poe writes in the Man of the Crowd, 1840, to allow themselves to be read, E.R. last Sichnik lees, and it does not permit itself to be read. In Heart of Darkness, the smile of the general manager of the central station provides a counterpart to what James here envisions. It suggests as well that, in the context of his own fin de siècle excursion into chaos, Conrad similarly discovered in the metaphor of sealed text an apt expression of the hermeneutical insecurity that betrays itself in an obsession with essential truths and impenetrable surfaces. An indefinable, faint expression of his lips, something stealthy, a smile not a smile, conveys what is otherwise occluded in the general manager's body, which seems for the most part to disclaim the intention of an attainable meaning. It was unconscious. This smile was, though just after he had said something it got intensified for an instant. It came at the end of his speeches like a seal applied on the words to make the meaning of the commonest phrase appear absolutely inscrutable. He inspired uneasiness, that was it. Uneasiness. Not a definite mistrust, just uneasiness, nothing more. You have no idea how effective such a faculty can be. Marlowe recalls once more encountering this enigmatic smile in the context of the general manager's characterization of the possession of insides as a misfortune. Once when various tropical diseases had laid low almost every agent in the station, he was heard to say, men who come out here should have no entrails. He sealed the utterance with that smile of his as though it had been a door opening into a darkness he had in his keeping. You fancied you had seen things, but the seal was on. Although indicative of it, the general manager's having come into his position because he was never ill and his having retained it because triumphant health in the general route of constitutions is a kind of power in itself or ultimately peripheral to the essential quality of his greatness, which seems to Marlowe to be his very unreadability, it being impossible to tell what could control such a man. He never gave that secret away. Perhaps there was nothing within him. 57. It makes sense, therefore, that of all those whom Marlowe encounters on his journey, this man alone, with a gesturing sweep of his short flipper of an arm, dares to become familiar. Trust to this, I say trust to this, with the forest, which bears on its vast face a mute high stillness that is as sealed as his smile, the immensity of the forest exactly meeting and measuring the nothingness within him, while the question it poses of most men, could we handle that dumb thing, or would it handle us, precisely balances the secret that the manager never gives away. Point 58. The general manager's smile is heir to that of the Gautama Buddha, descended from Mona Lisa's unfathomable smile, always with a touch of something sinister in it, and akin to the smiles on the expressive and puzzling. Striking and disturbing heads that face Gibbs's house. Point 59. Half a century earlier, Thomas de Quincey recalled seeing the smile that radiated from the lips of Memnon's head, then recently brought from Egypt, as something too awful to clothe itself in adumbrations or memorials of flesh. He fixes on this smile, as Marlowe himself has done, in the context of a larger consideration of the circumambient natural world, mentioning it in the course of his essay System of the Heavens as revealed by Lord Rosse's telescopes, 1846. One region of space, he notes, the nebula in Orion, hitherto blindly jealous of its secrets, had rendered them up submissively. Once William Parsons, the third Earl of Ross, had developed his all-conquering telescope, which measured the frightful magnitude, frightful depth, and dreadful distances that had made possible the unexampled defiance with which the nebula had resisted all approaches. De Quincey compares the solemn uncovering by astronomy to the reversing of some heavenly doom, like the raising of the seals that had been sealed by the angel in the Revelation. What is exposed to view and resolved, to use the argot of the discipline, is, according to De Quincey, a vision to dream of, not to tell, although he does tell, though not without a few words of prologue, without which, he claims, in the style of James's Douglas, who is also in possession of a story too dreadful to tell, and one he claims won't tell, though in the end he does tell, without any fault of mine, my description will be unintelligible. In order to see what I see, the obedient reader must do what I tell him to do, says De Quincey. He must take hold, in fact, of the sketch of the great nebula in Orion as reproduced in John Pringle Nichols' System of the World, 1846, and view the wretch upside down, at which point what will be forced to show out is a head thrown back, and raising its face, or eyes, if eyes it had, in the very anguish of hatred, to some unknown heavens. What should be its skull wears what might be an Assyrian tiara, only ending behind in a floating train. This head rests upon a beautifully developed neck and throat. All power being given to the awful enemy, he is beautiful where he pleases, in order to point and envenom his ghostly ugliness. Brutalities unspeakable sit upon the upper lip, which is confluent with the snout, for separate nostrils there are none. But the lower lip, which is drawn inwards with the curve of a conch shell, what a convolute of cruelty and revenge is there. Cruelty, to whom? Revenge, for what? Ask not, whisper not. Look upwards to other mysteries. Point 60. Given what has gone before, it seems unlikely that those other mysteries too, which De Quincey would redirect his reader's shocked attention, would adumbrate anything other than more of the same pomp of malice in the features of a universe newly disclosed as appalling in the exposure and, one might add, only to be seen from his own special perspective, just as it is resolvable only by Lord Ross's monstrous telescopic lens. Like De Quincey, who is attempting to unseal the eyes of his obedient reader so that they can see a face that, in the final analysis, may not exist outside of his own opium-tinged imaginings, James's governess also insists upon submission to her absolute authority for the proper unsealing of mysteries. And like De Quincey, she may be said figuratively, if not quite literally, to turn the household at Bly upside down as the only means available to her of revealing her perception that the unworldly beauty of Miles's body has become a screen that, according to her calculus, elides, points to, and envenoms otherworldly ugliness. In the end, however, she cannot resolve the meaning of Miles's deathbed utterance, which is also like a purloined letter available to view but finally unseen, or like the letter that, although sealed and directed, 167, never discloses to the master in Harley Street the mysteries of Bly, because Miles purloins it, or like Quint, whose ghostly presence and intentions the governess calls before her mind's eye as distinctly as she claims to see the letters she forms on this page, 103, although their mystery, that of the letters, that is, as well as of the presence that they combine to reconstruct, remains sealed in the locked drawer that holds the manuscript containing that page. Ruskin might have argued that the confusion that her narrative fails to resolve that it indeed transmits is the unfortunate consequence of a certain human pride. We might recall here her own admission of blasphemous ingratitude, that, as he maintains in his own brief disquisition on the nature of sealed texts, unreasonably insists upon perfect intelligibility as a criterion for knowledge that is in turn ill pursued and accompanied by a fall into misery of unbelief, of the sort that those overweening narrators and their heirs suffer. I know there are an evil mystery and a deathful dimness, Ruskin conceded, the dimness of the sealed eye and soul, but do not let us confuse these with the glorious mystery of the things which the angels desire to look into, or with the dimness which, even before the clear eye and open soul, still rests on sealed pages of the eternal volume. 61 Begotten of evil mystery and begetting a deathful dimness, Miles's final enigmatic statement remains for the governess, and by extension, for her readers, a sealed text whose obscurity conveys none of the nobleness that Ruskin conceived of as being perceivable in concealment. Persuaded, as Ruskin was, that every visible feature of natural things afforded glimpses of stable and substantial things, Dickens could comfort those mourning at the death of Little Nell, whose demise he in his capacity as artist was impelled to sanction and oversee by reminding them that in the destroyer's steps there spring up bright creations that defy his power, and his dark path becomes a way of light to heaven. 659.62 Writing in 1840, nearly half a century before James produced his self-obscuring text, Dickens could still insist upon the existence of an infinitely wise and beneficent author of all things, one defended in the pulpit as a being of infinite goodness and wisdom, all of whose dispensations must be kindly met, and wisely ordered, however severely they may be felt, and however inscrutable they may appear, one whose mysteries, as Ruskin had argued, and concealments, even, were necessary in all great art. 63 Writing 6 years after Dickens had published The Old Curiosity Shop, With the abysses of the heavenly wilderness suddenly and appallingly exposed, De Quincey imagines that the mysterious architect plays at hide-and-seek with his worlds, letting this world in particular be tortured into closer compression, again letting the screw be put upon it. Although the otherwise conservative De Quincey conceives of his metaphor as a means of celebrating humanity's Sisyphean tendency to shake off the oppression, yet his faith cannot mask what is revealed in his essay as the eternal temptation of the great molding power to attempt another turn of the screw, plunging further into aboriginal darkness, a world driven back and depressed from one deep to a lower deep, 64 miming an order of being and living an order of experience, hermeneutic and teleological, closer to that envisioned by De Quincey than that of Ruskin or Dickens. James offers his late Victorian audience a seraphic child who, following in the destroyer's steps, is hurled over an abyss, 198, while he leads his governess not into clearness, but into a darker obscure, 196.